They called it a celebration, but it felt like a coronation for everyone but me. The villa in La Jolla glittered with gold lights, champagne flowed like power, and I was seated at the very end of the banquet table, unnamed, unseen. He raised his glass, thanked his team, and smiled the way only men who think they own the room can smile. Then he leaned toward his lawyer and said loud enough for them to laugh, but soft enough to pretend it was private. "She's too dumb to read a contract." They all laughed. I didn't. I just took another sip of wine and smiled. Because my name is Loretta Caldwell. And I had already started rewriting the ending. The first time I realized I had become invisible was at my husband's 10-year company anniversary party. It was a Friday night in late September, the kind of evening when the air in La Jolla still smelled of salt and fading summer. Caldwell Equity Partners had rented out the entire cliffside villa overlooking the Pacific, draped in gold lights and white orchids, all orchestrated for the perfect photo ops. Everyone was there. Partners in tailored navy suits, wives in sleek cocktail dresses, influencers hired to pretend they cared about tech investments. I sat at the farthest end of the long banquet table, squeezed between the assistant to the event planner and some guy from logistics who kept checking his phone. There was no name card at my place setting. I hadn't even noticed until I saw the woman next to me squint at mine, confused, as if trying to remember who I was supposed to be. Grant stood at the head of the table naturally. Center of the universe. Tall, handsome in the polished way CEOs often are. He wore the navy suit I had chosen 2 months earlier when we went shopping together. He didn't mention that to anyone. He raised his glass, thanked his team, dropped in a few humble brags about their record-breaking quarter, and then added with a practiced smile that he couldn't have done it without the support of his loved ones. He didn't look at me. People clapped. I clapped too. After the speeches, servers flowed in like choreographed dancers, setting down amuse-bouches that looked more like sculptures than food. I reached for my wine, needing something to swallow down the awkward knot in my throat. That was when I heard it. "She's too dumb to read a contract." Grant said it low in that casual, confident voice that always made people lean in like he was letting them in on some great cosmic joke. His lawyer, Brad, I think his name was, laughed loud enough to draw eyes. A few others at their end of the table chuckled too. I didn't flinch. I kept my glass steady even as the wine turned bitter in my mouth. They didn't know I had heard. Or maybe they did, and didn't care. I smiled the same soft, unreadable smile I had mastered over 8 years of dinner parties and investment retreats and holiday cards addressed only to Mr. Caldwell. At the center of it all, Grant looked pleased. He always did when people laughed at his jokes. My dress was black silk, simple but elegant. I had picked it deliberately. I wanted to blend in, to observe without being observed. I had worn no jewelry besides my wedding ring. No makeup beyond a touch of foundation. I wanted to be plain. People underestimate the plain. Eileen sat closer to Grant in a pale blue chiffon gown that probably cost more than my studio's rent. Her hair was pinned in an elaborate twist that must have taken hours. She didn't speak to me all night. Not once. She barely looked in my direction except for one moment when I accidentally caught her gaze. Her eyes narrowed and she gave me a thin-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. That's when it hit me. I wasn't part of this family. I was part of the furniture. A polished accessory. I was tolerated, not loved. Respected only as long as I stayed quiet and in my place. I had once loved Grant. Really, I did. He was charming and ambitious and had this way of making you feel like you were the only one in the room when he spoke to you. He made me laugh in law school back when we were just 2 broke kids cramming for torts and dreaming of careers. We used to sit on the floor of our 1-bedroom apartment and talk about everything: politics, books, what we'd name our kids someday. But something changed when he started making money. Not all at once. It was a slow erosion. A joke that landed a little too hard. A decision made without asking. A meeting I wasn't invited to. Then came the house in La Jolla. The staff, the merger, the new assistant. The separate bank accounts. The parties where I was introduced not as Loretta but as Grant's wife, as if my name were a footnote. And me, I let it happen. I thought I was being patient, supportive. I believed in him and us. Until that night. Until I heard him say it. She's too dumb to read a contract. And just like that, something inside me shifted. I smiled. Not the empty kind I had worn all evening, but the real kind. The kind that starts in your chest and flickers up into your eyes. Because the thing is, I had read plenty of contracts. I had written some too. I stood up before dessert. Nobody noticed. Not Grant, not Eileen, not anyone at that table. I walked out past the valet heels clicking softly on stone, the sound almost drowned by the ocean. I got into my car, turned the ignition, and drove home. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I opened my laptop, clicked on a folder titled Luna Legal, and began rereading every agreement I had quietly archived over the last 4 years. Let them laugh. They would not be laughing for long. I used to think submission was love. That staying quiet, being agreeable, making things easier for everyone else was what a good wife did. When Grant and I got married, I didn't ask for much. I didn't fight him when he suggested we keep our finances separate, said it would make taxes simpler. I nodded when he said it was smarter for one of us to focus on the home while the other built the empire. We had just moved into the first place he bought under his name in Encinitas. A 3-bedroom with ocean views and overpriced furniture chosen by his mother. I remember standing in the living room barefoot, holding the box with my law books, when Eileen arrived with papers. She came in like she owned the place, all pastel linen and stiff perfume, and handed me a stack clipped together with her signature red pen marks. Just something to make things cleaner down the line, she said. It was a waiver. A full renunciation of claim to any Caldwell family trust or real estate assets, even in the event of divorce or death. Grant wasn't there. He was at a conference in Denver. I remember texting him about the documents, unsure, and he replied with 3 words. Just sign it. Eileen brought her own lawyer. He wore a gray suit and didn't make eye contact with me as I sat at the kitchen island trying to read the dense legal language. I was 25, still clinging to the idea that love meant trusting even when things felt off. Eileen stood across from me, hands folded neatly. You don't need to understand every word, sweetheart. You just need to be loyal. I signed. It was the first time I betrayed myself. The years that followed were a quiet erosion. At first, I didn't notice how many small freedoms I gave up. I stopped checking our joint expenses because there was no joint account. I stopped asking about the trust because I wasn't part of it. I stopped painting for a while. I told myself we were building something, and that meant sacrifices. But the sacrifices were always mine. Grant traveled constantly. Europe, Asia, New York. I stayed behind. Eileen moved into the guest house after her hip surgery and never moved out. She filled our fridge with food I didn't like, hired staff without asking, invited her bridge friends to stay for days at a time. You have such a nice life, she would say, pouring herself tea like this was her kitchen. Most women would kill for what you have. What I had was a gilded box, beautiful, curated, and utterly locked from the inside. One morning I came downstairs and found Eileen sitting at the table reading one of my old sketchbooks. These are lovely, she said, without looking up. Hobby things, I suppose. She closed the book and slid it back across the table like it had no weight at all. Why don't you focus on charity events or starting a little garden? Something productive. I smiled and thanked her for the suggestion. That afternoon, I bought a new tablet and began sketching again. Not for her, not for Grant. For me. At night, when the house was quiet and the Pacific breeze slipped through the windows, I'd sit on the floor of my studio and draw. I created women with wings, broken clocks, silent cities made of glass. I built my own world in pixels and code, and I started saving. Every dollar from digital commissions went into a private crypto wallet I named Solstice. Every receipt, every email, every invoice I cataloged meticulously. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was survival. The tipping point came when Grant forgot our anniversary. I had cooked dinner. Nothing extravagant. Just lemon pasta and red wine, something simple we used to make in college. I wore the earrings he once said made me look like I knew something. He walked in, dropped his briefcase, kissed the top of my head, and asked if I'd seen his navy tie. I didn't say a word. He left again that night for a supposed dinner with investors in Los Angeles. I saw the hotel charge on the shared credit card 2 days later. The room was booked for two. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I created a folder on my desktop and named it Winterlight. I filled it with contracts, scanned copies, metadata, statements from hidden accounts. I started to understand what control looked like. It didn't look like shouting or bruises. It looked like silence. Isolation. The slow starving of someone's identity until they forgot who they used to be. Eileen still reminded me to be grateful. One afternoon, as she handed me a check to donate under my name to a charity of her choice, she smiled and said, "You don't need to know everything, Loretta. Just stay in your lane." That was when I knew I wasn't staying anywhere. I had given them enough. They just didn't know what I had kept. Back when I was 20, I thought I would be a lawyer. UC Berkeley had been my dream school since I was in high school. I remember the exact moment I got the acceptance email. I was in the kitchen with my mom and we both screamed like teenagers at a concert. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She was a paralegal, had worked at the same firm in Oakland for nearly 20 years. She wanted more for me. I did too. My first year I devoured everything. Constitutional law, contract theory, case briefs. I had this stupid little ritual where I'd underline everything in blue and highlight in yellow. It made my books look like a war zone, but it helped me see patterns. Grant was a year ahead of me. He was cocky brilliant in that annoying way, always answering questions before the professor even finished asking. We met during a student law panel. He was charming, then different. He said he liked the way I thought, said I asked better questions than the professors did. We started studying together, then dating. He talked about firms, about politics, about power. I talked about fairness and reform. He teased me for being idealistic. Somewhere in the middle of my second year, something shifted. I couldn't breathe in that building anymore. The lecture halls felt too tight, the air too dry. I started sketching in the margins of my notes. At first it was just to stay awake, then it became the only thing that kept me sane. I loved the way a blank page made no demands. I told my mom first. She was devastated but quiet about it. She nodded slowly and asked if I had a plan. I said I wanted to study design, maybe animation. Maybe something in digital media. I didn't really know, only that I didn't want to be like the people around me anymore. I told Grant next. He didn't take it well. "You're walking away from a future for what art? It's not just art, it's something I can build." Build what? A Pinterest board? That was the first time he looked at me like I was fragile. Not in the romantic way. In the disposable way. But I left. I took night classes at a community college in San Diego after we moved there for his first job. He never asked what I was studying. I set up a tiny workspace in the guest room and started freelancing under different names. I created illustrations for blogs, visual storyboards, and then I discovered NFT art. It was like someone had handed me a language I had been trying to speak my whole life. I created Luna Nova during a thunderstorm. The name came from something I read once about the moon pulling the ocean toward it without anyone noticing. That's how I wanted to move. Quietly. With force. The first piece I minted was a sketch I had drawn the night Eileen called me an accessory. It was a woman made of glass, cracked but still standing, holding a mirror that reflected fire. It sold in 6 hours. Not for much, a few $100s in Ethereum, but it was mine. All of it. I used a new wallet. New email. I masked my IP address. I created a trail no one could follow. Every time Grant traveled, I worked. Every time Eileen insulted me, I opened a new canvas. My art changed too. Became sharper, less apologetic. I drew bleeding crowns, floating ledgers, wolves in suits with teeth made of ink. People started to notice. Not many. Just enough to make me feel seen. A gallery in Portland messaged me on Twitter asking if I would ever consider a physical show. I declined. I wasn't ready to show my face. I still had my law books. I kept them hidden in the back of the guest closet under old sweaters and winter boots we never used in California. Sometimes late at night I would pull them out and reread sections on corporate governance and fiduciary duty. I wasn't preparing for revenge. Not yet. I was just trying to remember who I used to be. Who I could still become. The turning point came when Luna Nova was included in a digital art collection curated by a major investor. They didn't know who I was. They just liked the work. One of the pieces sold for over $40,000. I didn't tell anyone. I put the money in the Solstice wallet and let it sit. Grant was in Switzerland that week, allegedly meeting with biotech founders. Eileen was hosting a dinner party with her charity board. I spent the evening barefoot on the kitchen floor eating takeout and watching the moon rise over the ocean. I looked around that big, perfect house and realized I didn't own a single thing in it. Except the passwords. Except the files. Except every single contract I had been archiving since the day I signed that waiver in our first home. No one had ever thought to ask what I was doing. And now they wouldn't be able to stop it. It started with a glass of Pinot and a fake smile. Grant came home one evening in early February, kissed me on the cheek like he still remembered how to play husband, and said he had an exciting new project. We were in the kitchen. I was sautéing mushrooms. He leaned against the counter like he always did when he was building up to something. I watched him from the corner of my eye. His suit was still crisp, his tie loosened just enough to look effortless. He never asked how my day was. He just launched into it. "We're starting a new fund," he said, targeted toward emerging markets in digital assets. "I want to put it under a separate entity for liability reasons." I stirred the pan, slowly waiting. "And I think it makes sense to have it under your name. Keep things clean, you know." Optics. There it was. He handed me a folder with the company name already filled in. Solera Holdings. His handwriting was on the sticky tab like it was a recipe I needed to review. "What is it exactly?" I asked, flipping through casually. "Just a shell," he said. "Standard stuff. No liability on your end. You're just the name." He poured himself a glass of wine, then added with a smirk. "Contracts are too much for your pretty head anyway. That's what I'm here for." I smiled. I even laughed light and rehearsed. That night, after he fell asleep on the couch with his laptop still open, I took the folder into my studio, scanned every page, and uploaded them to a locked drive labeled Quiet Echo. Then I picked up my phone and called Malcolm. He answered on the second ring. "Loretta, hi Malcolm. Do you still have time to look over something always? Send it over." Malcolm Greer had been my father's closest friend before Dad passed away. He had retired from active litigation 5 years ago, but still advised friends and old clients. He once handled a lawsuit involving tech firm fraud so complex it made national headlines. He was the first person who told me I had a head for loopholes. I trusted him with everything. I emailed him the documents at 1:17 a.m. At 6:42 a.m., he replied with one sentence. "We need to talk." I met him later that afternoon at his place in Del Mar. His home office smelled like coffee and legal pads, walls lined with casebooks, binders, and a framed copy of a Supreme Court decision he had helped influence decades ago. He looked at me over his glasses as I sat across from him. "Your husband is sloppy." I raised an eyebrow. Sloppy how he pointed at a paragraph near the bottom of the third page. The clause about fiduciary roles and ownership succession was vaguely worded and left room for future reassignment if the original signatory was found to have violated ethical standards related to financial transparency. In other words, Malcolm said if he commits financial fraud while you're listed as the principal and we rewrite this contract carefully, the entire holding could default to your sole ownership. I blinked. "You can do that. With a few clean amendments and a notarized addendum, yes. What about the timeline? We'd need to move fast. Before he tries to shuffle anything more." Malcolm sat back and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time since I was a teenager raiding his fridge with my dad. "You knew this might come someday, didn't you?" I nodded slowly. "I want to build it into every document moving forward, every structure, every fund. If he thinks I'm just the name, I want to make that name count." Malcolm smiled, not kindly, but with quiet respect. "Then let's give him what he wants." Over the next 2 weeks, I worked with Malcolm to build new layers into every contract Grant pushed my way. We used legalese so obscure even seasoned attorneys would need time to decipher it. I created a new email address, sent files from hotels and cafes using public Wi-Fi, never the house. When Grant asked me to sign the official Solera Holdings charter, I did it with a kiss on his cheek and a joke about how I hoped I wouldn't be arrested for whatever he was up to. He laughed. Of course not, babe. You're just the signature. Later that night, I updated the file in Quiet Echo and added a note at the top. He just gave me his empire. He just doesn't know it yet. The first real piece of bait had been laid. The trap wasn't just open, it was inviting. I slept well that night for the first time in months. He was already gone when I woke up. Grant had left a note on the counter next to his protein shake bottle, scrawled in that confident, half-legible handwriting of his. Early meetings. Back late, don't wait up. I made coffee, slowly savoring the quiet, the rare stillness in a house that always felt like a showroom. I stood barefoot on the cold tile floor, watching the fog roll in over the La Jolla cliffs. And then I went to work. Not on a canvas, not on a new Luna Nova piece. That morning, I opened my Quiet Echo folder and reread the Solera contract line by line, memorizing every clause Malcolm had helped me weave into the text. There it was on page 8, buried in legalese. In the event of misconduct, including, but not limited to, undisclosed financial transfers, asset misrepresentation, or breach of fiduciary duty by any stakeholder under the parent entity, all assets held under the Solera Holdings entity shall be reverted to the managing partner as a sole controlling authority. That managing partner was me. I saved a clean PDF, backed it up on 2 encrypted drives, printed a hard copy, and slid it into a manila folder. Then I went upstairs and did my makeup. Full face. Hair styled, heels. The version of myself Grant liked to parade around. He was home by dinner, smelling faintly of cigar smoke and ego. We're hosting Friday, he said, tossing his jacket over a chair. Hosting what investors? You'll be charming, right? I smiled, tilted my head. I'll wear the pearls. He laughed and kissed my forehead like I was a very obedient pet. That Friday, I played the part. I poured wine, complimented watches, laughed when people mocked NFTs like they hadn't just dropped 6 figures on pixelated animals. During dessert, Grant announced the launch of the Caldwell NFT Fund. We're building a legacy of digital permanence, he said, eyes gleaming. And none of it would be possible without the vision of my wife, Loretta. The applause came polite but genuine. I nodded graciously, lifted my glass. I caught Malcolm's eyes across the room. He was the only one not smiling. He just looked at me and gave the faintest nod. After the guests left, Grant pulled me close in the kitchen. You were perfect tonight. I laughed, leaning into his chest. I almost believed you meant that. He chuckled and poured himself a scotch. You make this all easier. You really do. I watched him drink, watched the way he turned away the second I stopped speaking. The next morning, I left a sketch pad out on the kitchen island. Just a casual thing. A doodle of a winged woman holding a flaming ledger. Grant passed by, glanced at it, and snorted. Still playing with those cartoons, I shrugged. Just clearing my head. He didn't ask what it meant. Over the next few weeks, I upped my performance. I asked dumb questions about compound interest. Forgot the passcode to our streaming account. Burned dinner on purpose. I let myself become the woman he already believed I was. At a fundraiser in Palm Springs, he introduced me to a hedge fund manager as the artist in the house. She doesn't touch the numbers. I laughed, resting my hand on his shoulder like a good trophy wife. They believed it. They always believed him. But behind every dinner party and business brunch, I was building something. A proposal. I approached Grant one night after he'd had 2 glasses of bourbon, when he was relaxed and pleased with himself. I've been thinking, I said, sitting next to him on the couch. What if we created a separate branch of the NFT fund, something focused entirely on legacy collections, artists who already have traction? It'll give us better leverage with the auction houses. He looked at me, surprised. You mean, you want to expand the fund? Yes. And I could lead it, manage the curation. We could call it Nova Series. Just a subarm. Controlled by Solera. He blinked, then grinned. You're really getting into this, I smiled. Well, you said I should take ownership of something. He kissed me, nodded, and told me to draw up the paperwork. I did. Only the paperwork wasn't just for the Nova series. It was a revised governance structure for Solera Holdings. I added language that consolidated managerial control embedded triggers that could activate a complete transfer of ownership under certain conditions. I masked them in compliance lingo, buried them in appendices. Malcolm reviewed it twice. Jason Rowe, our mutual contact and a longtime notary in Del Mar, pre-signed the accompanying affidavit. Grant barely skimmed the document. He was on a call when I slid it across the table. He signed it while typing. "Thanks, babe," he said, eyes still on the screen. I slipped the pages back into my folder and walked out to the terrace. The sun was setting, casting long orange streaks over the Pacific. I stood there a while listening to the waves. They always say water is soft, but over time even water carves through stone. I was done being soft. Now I was learning how to carve. The first file I saved was a forwarded invoice from Grant's assistant. It was a small thing, just a vendor billing detail with Tessa's name on the internal note. But it referenced an account I didn't recognize. A wire transfer labeled consulting retainer to a company I'd never heard of in Wilmington, Delaware. The signature at the bottom was Grant's. That was the day I started the folder named Static Rose. Every email, every invoice, every calendar entry I had access to went into that folder. I mirrored his inbox through the shared family account and began tagging anything that seemed unusual. Anything with Tessa's name. Anything with language about restructuring asset protection or performance-based bonuses. He was getting careless. Or maybe he just assumed I was still too naive to notice. I bought a miniature recorder, the kind lawyers use for field interviews. I sewed it into the lining of my tote bag and carried it to meetings, brunches, even car rides. Grant took most of his business calls on speaker. He never thought I was listening. At dinner, he talked openly about a new holding account in the Caymans. "We're shielding exposure," he said, swirling his wine. "You wouldn't understand, but it's necessary." I nodded slowly, playing with my fork. "I'm sure you're right." The recorder caught everything. Dates, figures, bank names. One night, he even dictated numbers aloud for Tessa to copy down while I was upstairs. The next morning, I checked the hallway camera footage and pulled the audio from the kitchen. Crystal clear. Malcolm helped me cross-check the details. Some of the companies weren't real. Others were shells tied to offshore accounts. It was textbook asset laundering, sloppily veiled under advisory services and side project language. I didn't just collect it. I organized it. 3 copies of everything. One encrypted and stored in a cold wallet that never touched Wi-Fi. One saved to a hidden cloud drive under an alias I'd created years earlier when Luna Nova first launched. And one printed and stored in a sealed document box I deposited into a private safety vault at a Wells Fargo branch in Escondido under a business LLC I owned through Luna Nova. Every page numbered, every file logged. Control wasn't just about having information. It was about knowing how to deploy it. Meanwhile, I called Heather. She'd been my roommate during undergrad now, a freelance investigative journalist working on digital finance fraud stories for small publications in California. She'd always had a nose for contradictions and an obsession with paper trails. She answered on the second ring. "Lo, wow. Been a minute." I leaned against the kitchen counter, keeping my voice low. "I have something. Might be big. And I need help staying invisible." I laid it out piece by piece. Not the revenge part, just the data. The pseudonym. The NFT sales. The sudden interest in holding companies under my name. Heather didn't speak for a while. Then she whistled. "This is a story waiting to explode, but you don't want it out." "Not yet," I said. She agreed. "Give me time. I'll build a skeleton and keep it airtight. I'll only publish when you say go." I trusted her with access to metadata from my early Luna Nova drops. We used blockchain analytics to cross-reference wallet IDs, locate repeat buyers, and identify 2 dummy accounts Grant had unknowingly purchased pieces through. He was investing in Luna Nova art. He didn't even know it was mine. Heather traced the flow of tokens and started mapping the timing. Each time Grant transferred money into one of his shell companies, there was a corresponding buy on the NFT chain. He was laundering his own funds into my pocket without knowing it. I added those screenshots to Static Rose. I stopped asking where he was going when he left for meetings. I didn't need to. I already had his calendar access mirrored to my phone. When he went to Miami, I checked the hotel receipt. 2 adults. Same last name listed under room service. Not Caldwell. Carver. Tessa's fake ID. More screenshots. By now, Static Rose had grown into a full legal repository. Enough to indict someone for wire fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. I had it all. And no one suspected a thing. One evening, as we sat on the patio and Grant talked about buying a penthouse in Vancouver, I reached for my wine and asked gently, "Would you ever put anything under my name again?" He laughed. "No offense, babe, but you're too sweet to handle real ownership. You hate reading legal stuff." I smiled. "That's true. It always makes my head hurt." He leaned back satisfied. "That's why I take care of everything." The recorder hummed quietly in my tote beside the chair. I looked out over the ocean, the sky melting into burnt orange. The wind shifted slightly cold and promising. I wasn't gathering anymore. I was arming. He brought the folder home like a prize, smug and humming as he walked through the door. "Big news, babe," Grant said, dropping it onto the kitchen island like it weighed 1,000 pounds of success. 49%. Caldwell NFT Fund. We've got a buyer. I looked up from my tea, blinking like I didn't already know. "That's huge. Who's the buyer?" Lintex Holdings. He pronounced it slowly, deliberately, like it was supposed to impress me. Delaware-based, clean history, lots of capital. Quiet money. I flipped the folder open, careful not to show recognition. On the surface, Lintex looked legitimate, registered LLC, strong cash flow, vague consulting business. But Heather and I had already dug through their network. The shell companies, the transfers, the ties to Nassau. And most importantly, the payment authorization signed by Tessa Carver 3 months ago under a Lintex alias. It was all a front, a golden box with rot inside. "They want to come in with a non-controlling interest," Grant said, walking to the fridge. 49%. Just enough to get funding, not enough to touch operations. "And they want my signature, yeah. You're the managing partner, remember?" He chuckled. "You don't have to understand the terms, just need to look pretty and sign." I traced the edge of the folder. "And when would you like me to do that?" "Tomorrow. We're meeting with Jason Rowe. He'll notarize. Shouldn't take 10 minutes. Jason. Perfect. He was neutral, experienced, and just old school enough to respect paper more than personalities. Grant leaned over the counter and tapped the folder again. "It's already been reviewed. No need to overthink it." "Of course not," I said. "I trust you." He kissed my cheek and left for a conference call. I waited until the front door clicked shut before lifting the contract out of the folder and laying it flat on the counter. There it was, 16 pages stapled twice, clean formatting, professional headers. It looked just like any other strategic investment agreement. But Section 13.3 referenced a third-party consulting fee. Page 11 included a clause that allowed funds to be redistributed through an offshore arm. And one of the supporting documents listed a bank account number I'd already seen on a flagged transaction to Tessa's company. They thought they'd masked it well. But it wasn't enough. Not against someone who had spent the last year becoming invisible in plain sight. I scanned the entire file, renamed it Thorndraft, and sent it to Malcolm. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up. "This is the one," he said flatly. "This is where we make it irreversible." We met that afternoon in his office. He wore his courtroom glasses, the ones with the thin black frames that made him look 10 years younger and twice as dangerous. "We keep the structure intact," he said, flipping to the signature page. "We bury our clause inside the compliance appendix. Section 17.4. What does it say? If the buyer or any party acting on their behalf is found to have misrepresented the source of funds or violated any provision of domestic or international finance law, their shares are immediately and unconditionally buyers, wheel and dow, forfeited, and transferred to the managing partner. No arbitration. No delay. And we make it retroactive. Yes. Backdated, effective from the signing date. What about the arbitration waiver? Already built in. They'd have to sue themselves to stop it. The next morning, Jason Rowe greeted us with a warm nod. His office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same dusty law books. Same dark oak shelves, same brass notary seal. We slid the documents across the table. Jason read through silently. He was meticulous, deliberate. By the time he got to the signature pages, his eyes flicked up to me. You understand what you're signing. I do. And you're doing this willingly. Absolutely. He handed me the pen. I signed. Full name. Date. Clean strokes. Then passed it to Grant. Grant didn't read a word. He scrawled his signature in 3 seconds flat, barely glancing at the page. There we go, he said, slapping the folder closed. Jason notarized every page, affixed his seal, and stood. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. You've just made a powerful deal. Oh, we have, I said quietly. That night, Grant was in a good mood. He played music while cooking, opened a second bottle of wine, and joked about yachts in Mallorca. I laughed in all the right places. Smiled at all the right moments. And after dinner, I took the signed document into my studio. I scanned it. Labeled it Thorn 47. Uploaded 3 copies, one to the offline drive, one to the Luna Nova cloud, and one to the encrypted Static Rose archive. Then, I printed the hard copy and placed it in a red envelope. The last red envelope. That weekend, Heather sent confirmation Lintex had wired the first installment of funds from an account in the Cayman Islands routed through 2 tax havens flagged by the U.S. Treasury. I forwarded it to Malcolm with 3 words. Clause. Trigger. Active. He replied instantly. Ownership reverted. Clean. Untraceable. That night, Grant fell asleep next to me like everything was still his. And I lay in bed knowing for the first time that it wasn't. It was mine. All of it. And he had handed it to me willingly, proudly, stupidly. Signed, sealed, delivered. By his own hand. It started with the sound of glass shattering. I was in the upstairs hallway when I heard it. A heavy crash followed by something splintering against the living room wall. By the time I got downstairs, Grant had knocked over a lamp and sent one of the bar stools flying into the marble countertop. His face was red, veins pulsing at his temples. You think this is funny, he barked. I said nothing. He held his phone out like a weapon. On the screen was Heather's article, already climbing in shares, already linked in 3 finance blogs and 2 crypto investor subreddits. The headline was simple and lethal. The real face behind Luna Nova. How a quiet woman built a digital empire. My picture was there, sharp and striking. Not the passive wife they all remembered. Not the woman in pearls behind a silent husband. Just me in my studio, surrounded by pieces of my own creation. Grant slammed the phone on the table and grabbed the divorce papers he had already printed. We're doing this now, Loretta. You sign this today and we walk away clean. You get a payout, you keep your art, but you don't touch the fund. You don't touch my company. Your company. He pointed at the pages. Sign it or I'll drag you in the media. I'll tell everyone you're a fraud. That you lied about Luna Nova, that you used my resources, my platform, to build your fantasy brand. You'll be ruined. I took the papers from his hand and flipped through them. Everything in his draft was slanted. Fast-track dissolution. Waiver of spousal claims. No contest to financial holdings. Complete confidentiality. You think I'm scared of headlines? I asked quietly. He narrowed his eyes. You think they won't eat you alive when I tell them what kind of wife you were? I met his stare. Let's go to court. He flinched like I had slapped him. You want to play this dirty? I smiled. Number. I want to play it legal. He stared at me for a long time, and for the first time in months he had no comeback. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table. The next morning his mother showed up. Eileen Caldwell in her oversized sunglasses and cashmere coat stood at the doorway like she owned the foundation the house was built on. Loretta, she said sharply, we need to discuss the property. I let her and offered her tea and waited for the storm. This house was purchased by Grant. You've had your fun playing artist, but don't forget where the title deed lies. I stirred my tea calmly. I haven't. We intend to file a civil claim if you do not vacate within 30 days. I set the spoon down. You can try. But the deed was transferred to me 4 years ago as part of the restructuring of the Caldwell Trust. Signed by Grant. Notarized by Jason Rowe. Her face went pale. That was for tax purposes. That was symbolic. I opened a drawer and pulled out the original title documents. Unfortunately for you, symbolism holds up quite well in court when it comes with signatures and a stamp. She reached for the paper, but I slid it back. This house is mine, Eileen. And while I don't mind you visiting, I will ask you to use the doorbell next time. Her composure cracked. You ungrateful little parasite. I stood. You raised a man who believed a woman with a quiet voice had no claws. That's not my fault. She turned on her heel and stormed out, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble. Later that night, Grant tried again. He came into my studio, holding a glass of whiskey, his tie loosened, voice low. Let's not drag this out. You'll get the headlines. But you and I both know where the real power is. I kept sketching, not looking at him. The real power is in who owns the narrative. He stepped closer. They're calling me a thief. A liar. I paused my pencil. You are both. He laughed bitterly. You think you're better than me now? I met his eyes. Number, I think I always was. You just didn't notice. He left without another word. By morning, Heather's article had reached national syndication. Luna Nova trended on Twitter. Artnet requested an exclusive. CNBC wanted to profile the invisible woman behind digital success. Grant's lawyer called that afternoon. I answered on speaker, sitting beside Malcolm. We'd like to resolve this quietly, he said. Mr. Caldwell is open to discussion. I'm open to court, I said. There was a pause. You're making a spectacle. Number, I'm giving one. He wrote the script. I just added a twist. We ended the call. The game was no longer hidden, now it was war. And I had already claimed the first victory. They walked into the courtroom like it was a theater performance they had already cast themselves in. Grant in a tailored gray suit, smiling like he was doing the world a favor by showing up. Tessa in a sleek cream blouse and designer heels seated quietly at his side like a well-trained shadow. And Eileen, of course, in navy silk and pearl earrings, her chin-high eyes scanning the room like it smelled offensive. I wore a black coat over a simple dress and took my seat at the plaintiff's table, quiet, unnoticed, exactly as I wanted to be. The bailiff called order. The judge entered. The case number was read aloud. Caldwell versus Caldwell. Grant leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, then smirked. When the judge asked if either party would like to make an opening statement, Grant's lawyer stood first. Your Honor, this is a straightforward divorce proceeding. My client, Mr. Grant Caldwell, is prepared to honor a reasonable settlement. However, we find it regrettable that the opposing party is attempting to complicate this process by conflating personal insecurity with legal claims. He glanced in my direction and smiled tightly. We also find it unusual that someone with no formal business training or legal expertise would insist on contesting contracts that she likely did not fully understand. Grant chuckled audibly, loud enough to turn heads. She's too dumb to read a contract, he said, laughing to himself. A few people in the gallery murmured. I kept my face neutral. The judge lifted a brow. Mr. Caldwell, I advise you to remain silent unless asked to speak. Grant raised his hands mockingly and leaned back. Of course. My apologies. When my turn came, I stood slowly, gathered my notes, and walked to the front. I didn't look at Grant. I didn't have to. Your Honor, I have evidence to submit to the court. Documents that pertain to ownership, financial transfers, and the legality of key contracts referenced in this case. Permission granted, the judge said. I handed a USB to the court clerk, who plugged it into the screen system. The monitors lit up. The first slide notarized scans of the Lintex partnership agreement. Then the amendments. Highlighted in yellow was section 17.4, the clause Malcolm and I had buried. The one that shifted everything. The gallery leaned forward. Next slide, wire transfer receipts from the Lintex account in the Cayman Islands. Dated 3 days before the signing. Labeled consulting fees. Linked to Tessa Carver. Then offshore account screenshots. Financial trails from Caldwell Equity into dummy firms. I spoke calmly. These are confirmed transactions routed through international tax havens by entities associated with Mr. Caldwell and Miss Carver. The next slide, emails. Screenshots of internal memos messages Grant sent from our home office. I read aloud. Don't worry, she never reads this stuff. She just signs. She doesn't even know this shell exists. Gasps. Then came the contract for the house. The title deed. Signed and transferred 4 years ago. Stamped by Jason Rowe. Then the art licensing documents. Proof that Luna Nova had operated as an LLC under my name for 5 years. That I had filed independent taxes, owned the digital rights, and received no funds from Grant's company. Then the full clause list every legal trigger Grant had ignored. Each time I clicked, another line of defense fell. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell's team asserts that I did not understand the contracts I signed. The irony is that Mr. Caldwell didn't understand the ones he signed. Grant sat frozen. Tessa clutched her handbag like it could shield her. Grant's lawyer stood. We request a recess. Denied, the judge said, leaning forward. Do you have a response to this evidence? The lawyer stammered. We were not aware of these documents. The judge looked unimpressed. Then perhaps you should have read the contracts. I turned slightly toward Grant. You said I was too dumb to read a contract. My voice didn't rise. I didn't need to shout. But I didn't need to read yours. Because I wrote mine. Grant's face was pale, his hands clenched on the edge of the table. The courtroom was silent except for the soft clicking of the monitors as the last slide loaded Heather's article blown up on the screen titled in bold. The woman who outmaneuvered a millionaire. The judge tapped his pen. We will reconvene this afternoon to continue reviewing the full documentation. This court takes allegations of financial fraud and asset misrepresentation seriously. He banged the gavel. Recess granted. 30 minutes. People stood murmuring, shifting. I walked back to my seat, slowly passed by Grant as I sat. He didn't look at me, but I knew he could feel it. The balance had shifted. And we weren't playing by his script anymore. The judge's eyes scanned the court like a man who already knew the ending but wanted to hear it confirmed out loud. He called the first witness. Mr. Malcolm Foster, please approach. Malcolm rose from the bench, calm and iron straight in a charcoal suit. The same man who had once coached my father through a hostile merger now walked toward the witness box as the quiet executor of everything Grant never saw coming. He was sworn in, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a copy of the Lintex agreement. Please state your qualifications. Malcolm Foster. Retired attorney, former partner at Foster Greer LLP. 42 years specializing in corporate structuring, fiduciary duty law, and contract litigation. And your role in this case: I served as legal advisor to Mrs. Caldwell in the creation and execution of the amended NFT fund agreement with Lintex Holdings. He flipped to a page mid-document. Clause 17.4, drafted by myself and Mrs. Caldwell. Reviewed 3 times. This clause, should the buyer be found in breach of federal or international finance law, transfers all equity and rights of the NFT fund to the managing partner. He held up the notarized version. This was signed by Mr. Grant Caldwell and Mrs. Loretta Caldwell. Witnessed. Certified. Filed. Grant shifted in his seat. His lawyer scribbled something, but didn't raise his head. Malcolm continued, cool and unhurried. To be clear, this clause is not ambiguous. It is direct. It overrides all other control or asset clauses if a violation is discovered. No further questions. The court called Jason Rowe next. The man looked exactly as he had the day he notarized our trap, buttoned up, practical, quietly serious. Jason, you were the notary on this agreement. Yes, Your Honor. Did you confirm the identities of both parties? I did. And I asked both if they understood the contents of what they were signing. And how did Mr. Caldwell respond? He said, and I quote, She doesn't know what half this means, but she signs whatever I give her. Just needs to look official. He signed in my presence. I affixed my stamp and filed it accordingly. Jason sat down. Not a hair out of place. Then the court called Heather Lynn. She wore black. Subtle earrings. No visible emotion. Miss Linney recently published a verified investigative profile on Mrs. Caldwell's identity as Luna Nova Correct, based on over 8 months of research and source interviews. Do you possess audio evidence relevant to this court? I do. She set her recorder down, pressed play. Grant's voice spilled out into the silent courtroom full of confidence and condescension. She just signs the papers. Doesn't even ask. She thinks NFTs are art shows with wine. I handle everything. She's a placeholder. The second voice, Tessa, cut in laughing. She thinks she owns the fund. But we moved half the crypto through the shell last week. She doesn't even know it exists. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge raised his hand for silence. Miss Carver, please stand. Tessa stood face drained of all blood. You are hereby held for questioning under suspicion of conspiracy to commit financial fraud and laundering. The bailiff moved toward her. She clutched her purse, looked at Grant, but he didn't move. Her voice was low, cracked. Grant. Say something. But he didn't. She was escorted out, her heels tapping once, then dragging. And Eileen. She sat motionless for almost a full minute. Then quietly rose, gathered her bag, and walked out. No words. No farewell glance. Just quiet retreat. The judge opened the main file, tapping the final page with the weight of judgment. Having reviewed all evidence, including the notarized agreements, the financial transfers, and the audio recordings, this court affirms the legality of Clause 17.4. He paused. The entirety of Caldwell NFT Fund, including associated assets and holdings, is to be transferred to Mrs. Loretta Caldwell effective immediately. Gasps. One person clapped before realizing it wasn't appropriate. I stood, slowly stepped forward, and faced the man who once told people I wasn't worth the paper my name was printed on. Grant stared ahead, motionless. You told everyone I was too dumb to read a contract. I kept my voice even. No rage, no triumph, just truth. But the truth is I didn't need to read yours. Because I wrote mine. He blinked. Just once. And it was over. The judge's gavel struck. Court adjourned until property division review. Malcolm gathered the papers beside me. Heather gave a small nod from the gallery. I walked out of that courtroom without looking back. Not because I didn't care, but because everything I needed to say had already been signed, sealed, and witnessed. And now the story they tried to write for me was just ash on the floor. The court ruling spread faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, Grant's business accounts were locked. A temporary federal freeze order followed shortly after, citing suspicion of wire fraud, improper offshore activity, and failure to disclose conflict of interest assets during divorce proceedings. It hit the financial news cycle by morning. Every time someone searched his name, they didn't see Forbes covers anymore. They saw headlines. Caldwell Empire implodes amid fraud allegations. Luna Nova wins legal battle that shocked Silicon Beach from trophy wife to power player. How Loretta Caldwell rewrote the rules. Tessa was served that same week. She was scheduled to speak at a crypto panel in Austin. Instead, she was pulled aside at the airport by 2 U.S. Marshals just before stepping through TSA. A journalist from Heather's network snapped a photo. Tessa in a beige pantsuit, frozen mid-step with her ID still in hand. The subpoena she received was explicit: appear in court to answer for her role in a series of wire transfers linked to Lintex Holdings, a Cayman-based shell used to reroute investor funds. Heather sent me a copy of the court clerk's notes. Tessa didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just whispered one name. Grant. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. Not hidden, just focused. 3 days after the ruling, I filed articles of incorporation for the Luna Equity Foundation. The plan had lived in my notebook for over 2 years. Now it was real. Backed with $22 million in assets, entirely separate from my settlement or personal wealth, the foundation's mission was to support women artists trapped in financial control. Not just grants or gallery space. legal defense, contract education, emergency relocation stipends, financial literacy counseling, one-on-one mentorship programs with successful digital creators. I donated my first Luna Nova drop of the year to fund the launch. Within 12 hours, every NFT in the collection had sold out. The next morning, the press began calling. Heather was the first to run the story under Culture Current. Headline: she didn't just win. She rebuilt the system, the rise of the contract phoenix. That phrase, contract phoenix, caught fire. By the end of the week, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and Bloomberg had all picked it up. I wasn't naive. I knew media could pivot quickly, but I also knew that for once the narrative was mine. And it was powerful. While the foundation prepared its public rollout, Grant scrambled to regain ground. He tried to launch a counterstatement through a PR agency still loyal to his name. They sent press kits to 4 major outlets claiming I had forged contracts, misused marital assets, and defrauded his company. They even implied I had manipulated public opinion by using sympathy as a currency. Unfortunately for him, Heather wasn't finished. She had saved something. A full-length audio recording from that infamous 10th anniversary party. The one that started it all. She'd been sent the clip anonymously months before the trial, but waited to release it until it mattered most. In the recording, Grant could be heard boasting to a table of colleagues and investors. She signs what I put in front of her. Doesn't ask questions, doesn't need to. She's too dumb to read a contract anyway. He laughed. Others laughed with him. The file leaked online that afternoon. Within hours, 3 outlets that had published Grant's version retracted their articles. 2 editors personally reached out to me with apologies. The PR firm representing Grant released a neutral statement and cut ties. His last ally closed the door, and he knew it. A week later, I received an official request for mediation from his legal team. Too late. That door had closed the moment he signed the fund over to me. As for Eileen, she simply vanished. I heard through an old friend of hers that she had sold the beachfront house quietly within 10 days of the verdict. She now lived in a quiet rental in a town outside Sedona. No staff, no press, no appearances at charity galas. According to the same friend, Eileen had tried to attend one final luncheon with her social circle in La Jolla. No one saved her a seat. No one took her call again. Even in silence, the judgment had come. But I wasn't thinking about them. I spent my mornings in the new Luna Equity office in Venice Beach, an open loft with tall windows and workstations filled with women who, like me, were done being underestimated. We planned outreach events in low-income districts, built contracts in plain English, designed mentorship boards with practicing lawyers, artists, and financial advocates. At night, I went home to a quiet I had earned. No raised voices, no insults passed off as jokes. Just the sound of wind and waves through an open window. One afternoon, I found myself back in my studio watching light fall across a blank canvas. For a moment, I saw my reflection in the window. Not the woman they had laughed at. Not the name they tried to erase. But someone I had become on my own terms. Someone who didn't have to read their contract. Because she was finally writing her own. The gallery smelled of fresh paint and soft citrus from the bowl of lemons near the reception desk. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to remember every detail. The white walls, the polished concrete floor, the gentle hum of voices admiring the work, pausing, reflecting. It was opening night for Luna Equity's first public showcase. The exhibit was titled Burned Pages, and each piece had been created by a woman who once believed her voice wasn't worth signing her name. At the far end of the room, beneath a skylight that turned gold at dusk, stood the final piece. Mine. A towering canvas nearly 10 feet tall filled with black and crimson strokes. A phoenix in mid-flight wings, blazing flames devouring the shredded remains of a legal contract at its feet. The signature on the burning page was familiar. I hadn't painted it for symbolism, I painted it for closure. I stepped closer, adjusted the small plaque beneath the frame, and felt the warmth of the spotlights at my back. Behind me, footsteps slowed. Someone stopped beside me. A woman. Mid-40s. Blonde hair pulled into a low bun. eyes sharp with curiosity. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. She just asked quietly, almost like the question had been burning in her chest. Did you ever forgive them? I looked at the painting. The torn page. The fire that didn't destroy but revealed. No, I said. Then I turned to her, smiled gently. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's how I walk free. She nodded. And I knew she understood. Behind us, people murmured about the pieces. A woman wept quietly in front of a piece painted by a former domestic abuse survivor. A man took a photo of the quote beneath one sculpture. She was silent not because she lacked words, but because she was learning which ones would hold power. A journalist asked if I would pose in front of the phoenix. I did. Just once. Not smiling. Not cold. Just present. Later that night, I returned to the studio alone, not the one I used to hide in. This was the new space perched above a bookstore in Venice Beach, with windows that caught the morning fog and shelves lined with unfinished ideas. I changed into a soft t-shirt, tied my hair back, and returned to my easel. On the floor beside me were files for the next round of Luna equity grantees. 10 women. 10 contracts they would no longer sign in fear. On my desk was a letter, unopened. It was from Grant. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. Regret. Blame. Maybe even apology dressed in pride, but none of it mattered. He was still awaiting trial. His lawyers had tried to negotiate twice, both times denied. The last update I received from my attorney was that the IRS had filed charges separately. He wasn't talking now, not publicly, not to reporters. But silence doesn't undo signatures. Tessa had taken a plea deal and was now working clerical duty for a bankruptcy firm in Glendale. Heather said she'd spotted her once in a diner near the courthouse. Alone, reading old magazines. As for Eileen, no one knew for sure. Some said she lived in a rental near the mountains. Others believed she'd changed her name. She hadn't tried to contact me. I imagined she wouldn't. I didn't wish her harm. I simply didn't think about her anymore. Some people asked me if I felt victorious, if I felt like I'd won. But the truth was simpler. I didn't need to win anymore. Because I was no longer trying to survive someone else's version of my life. I was living mine. Fully. Freely. And finally. Sometimes I think about the silence that filled my days before everything exploded. How often I mistook it for peace. How long I spent convincing myself I was lucky to be chosen even if I was never heard. But not anymore. Now when I speak, I hear my own voice. Not begging. Not defending. Just truth. And that's enough. If you've ever been underestimated just because you were quiet or dismissed because you didn't fight loud enough, I see you. Your silence didn't mean weakness. It meant you were watching. Listening. And maybe like me, you were simply waiting for the moment you'd rise. Now it's your turn. Tell your story. I'd love to hear it.